Evening and welcome. I hope you're all taking best care this evening. And for those who don't yet know me, my name is Nina and I'm Curator of Programs and Interpretation at the Williams College Museum of Art. Before we begin this evening's program, I have just a few technical notes. First, we do anticipate this program will run a little over an hour. And this program tonight will also be recorded and will be available on the museum's website in the coming weeks. Also, at any time throughout the program, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat or Q&A feature. We'll be answering questions throughout the program this evening, and you can find the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom navigation bar. If you do have any technical difficulties throughout the program, please feel free to write us in the chat at any time, and my colleagues and I will do our best to help you. This evening's program is also being captioned with thanks to Terry Gibson, who is serving as our live captioner this evening. You can enable or disable these captions, adjust the size of the captions, or see the full transcript for the program by clicking on the closed captions button at the bottom of your Zoom navigation bar. With that, I am so delighted that you can join us for tonight's discussion and demonstration of practice and process in Indian drawing with Murad Mumtaz. Murad is both an accomplished artist trained in the traditional art of North Indian painting, and specifically the miniature tradition, as well as assistant professor of art at Williams College. This semester, he is teaching a studio art course titled Tasvir Khana, Technique and Practice of Indian Drawing and Painting. Throughout the semester, students learn from studying original works of Indian art that are on display right now at the Williams College Museum of Art, and are practicing these techniques themselves in the museum's galleries. Tonight, Murad, along with Elizabeth Gallerani, our curator of Mellon academic programs, and Amber Orosco, a graduate student in the history of art at Williams College, will discuss two works of art from the museum's collection, a botanical study and a portrait, and demonstrate some of the traditional drawing techniques and practices seen in these examples. If you would like to follow along with some of the techniques this evening yourself, all you will need tonight is a sharp pencil and a piece of paper. If you are interested in learning more about this topic, we encourage you to visit the museum's exhibition website, and we will be sharing a link in the chat with you for that. Throughout the semester, we'll actually be posting a series of videos with Murad that go even more in depth to the techniques, practices, and processes we will touch on today. So definitely, if you're interested, do check out that link and stay tuned for more. Finally, on April 15th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have a follow-up program with Murad, along with the scholar of South Asian art, Gina Kim, who will be in discussion about the material and cultural history of pigments used in South Asian painting. And we'll also share a link to that program in the chat for you as well. And with that, I would love to welcome my wonderful colleagues, Liz and Amber and Murad, onto screen to welcome you tonight and to take away the program. Thank you all so much for being here.
Hello, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Nina. My name is Murad Mumtaz, and I'm the assistant professor here at Williams, and I'm extremely excited to participate in this wonderful program.
Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Gallerani. I'm the curator of Mellon academic programs at WICMA. Had the pleasure of co-curating the exhibition with Murad, and just again, welcome you all.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amber Orosco. I'm a current graduate student at Williams, and this year I'm working with Liz as the academic engagement intern at WICMA. In this semester, I'm working with Murad as the teaching assistant for the studio course Tasvir Khana.
Yes, this is one of the exhibition artworks that are in our exhibition, which the students are using in the course as well. And it really sums up a lot of the techniques that we are looking at in this class. So the term Tasvir Khana itself is a Persian term, Tasvir Khane, which means a workshop, a painting workshop. So it's really the space, the atelier, the studio. And the practice itself is known as Musavvari, Musavvari in Persian. And in Hindi, it's known as Chitrakala, Chitrakala. And the term began to be used primarily in India, the Tasvir Khana, in the 16th century onward, during the time of the Mughal dynasty, which was one of the greatest dynasties in Indian history. And it went from the 16th to the 19th century and established a lot of artistic and cultural precedents that have an impact in South Asia to this day. And one of them is the practice of Indian painting, which is still being practiced both in Pakistan and in India as a contemporary art form as well. So some of the aspects that we think about when we talk about Indian painting, miniature painting, a backbone of this skill, of this technique is the outline. And you have a lot of different types of outline. And you notice if you look at any traditional Indian painting, everything is usually bound or contained within a beautiful, refined outline. Sometimes it's a calligraphic outline, sometimes it's a wiry outline. In this case, this particular painting showing 2 elephants, you can really see the mass and bulk and expression of the elephants depicted by this really expressive, bold outline, which is a particular trait for this school. And that's something that we start off with in our course as well, by understanding how to make a minute, controlled, refined line.
So this is a view of the exhibition itself in one of the galleries at WICMA. It has 11 different paintings from different areas throughout India, drawn from the museum's collection. And this is a real strength of the WICMA collection, especially paintings from the 17th to 19th centuries. And what we've done, and you can see in this view and then also in the next view as well, is really excited to be able to use this gallery as an active studio space for the students. That means that they're sitting on the floor on a cushion. They're using these wooden boards as backrests in a very traditional way that would have been done in a Tasvir Khana. And we also were able to really infuse this throughout the design of the exhibition. So having the cushions and the boards really right in the center of the gallery, but also by hanging the paintings lower, knowing that the students would be seated on the floor, sometimes seated on gallery stools, really wanting the students to be able to see them clearly and focus on that experience of a studio class being in the exhibition gallery. So this is another view here, just to show that the range of works that we selected from the collection. So at this point, I'd love to pass it back to Murad to talk a little bit about the different materials that the students and other practitioners would have used in a Tasvir Khana.
Thank you, Liz, for that. And so a lot of the materials that we are using, I'll just go through them. A lot of the pigments that we make are, of course, all natural, organic, or inorganic, but they're all natural pigments. We use gum arabic or sometimes animal bone glue as the binder. And usually we put the paint that we are immediately using in seashells because they're really easy to contain. They can dry and they don't come off. And then you can, because it's water-based, you can just mix a little bit of water and reactivate the paint. So here you see yellow orpiment. This is a form of cochineal red pigment, all important pigments that are used. And then for the paper, we have, the paper is known as a vasli, V-A-S-L-I. And this is also handmade paper that you are getting from India, from Rajasthan, where one of the last few families are still practicing this particular art form of making traditional Indian paper. It is used, it is made of jute, sometimes hemp fiber, and sometimes cotton rag, sometimes a mixture of all those. And in order to make a vasli, you take 2 or 3 thin sheets of paper, and then you glue them using flour glue that you make, that you cook. And then you paste all those sheets together so that you have a resistant, a really thick, but also supple at the same time material. And then you usually use a cowrie shell to burnish the surface so that it's really fine and smooth. And then in order to prime it, we use opaque white pigment called safeda, SAFAIDA. These days we use zinc white, but traditionally they would use a lot of lead whites as well in order to really block all the pores or irregularities of the paper. And then you burnish it again upside down on a hard surface like glass or marble, and then you're ready to make your drawing or painting. And for the brushes, for most of the broader washes, we use sable hair brushes, but for the main detailed work, what we use is a brush made out of the hair of a squirrel's tail. So you take the hair that you want, select them, and make a brush out of that using a bamboo stick for a handle. Usually, the way I was trained was to use a pigeon quill that you cut, and then you can pass the hair through that. So the beauty of this brush is that it has a sort of spring to it. It's got this little curve, and when you apply it onto the paper, it has a perfect point at the tip, and yet it's thick at the bottom, so it can take in a lot of pigment and water, so it can run for a long time while making an extremely refined, minute line as well. But today, what we will be doing is something which is more of a modification, in the sense that as the practice has developed and come into the modern and contemporary as a practice, the way we were taught, I was taught in Lahore at the National College of Arts, where it was offered as an undergraduate program. So I did it as an undergraduate program, and a lot of the practices that would take 8 years, 10 years, 6 years to master had to be condensed in 3 or 4 years. So one of those modifications was that rather than what a usual person starting off would use would be brush, but then it would take him months and months to get used to the brush, we were trained to use a pencil, something which anyone can pick up and sharpen. So it's very easy to jump into this practice for anyone. Anyone listening into our, watching our program today can just pick up a piece of paper, sharpen a pencil. The main difference is that we actually carve the pencil with a blade into this sort of needle-like point, and then we take sandpaper and make it really, really sharp at the tip so that it mimics the squirrel hair brush. So it has a sort of similar type of point, so that when after 2-3 weeks or maybe a month in the course we get to the brush, the students are already comfortable using something very refined. Already their hand muscles and their eye and their coordination is already built up, so that it's not such a big jump when you actually use the squirrel hair brush. So that's what we'll be doing today, something which is very easy to use, a pencil and paper.
And actually, Murad, there was an excellent question from an audience member if the squirrel brushes are available commercially. So if you could speak to that, maybe speak up a little bit so we can hear you a bit better. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So yes, the squirrel hair brushes are available in India from the same place that we get our paper from. The name of the family is Hussain paper makers. They are from a little town called Sanganer in Rajasthan. And you can buy both paper and brushes from that family who continues to make these traditional materials.
Thank you so much, Murad. So at this point, do you want to maybe do a warm up for us and for the audience members on line work? And this could be a great opportunity for any of our audience to grab their own pencil and paper too.
Yes, we should jump right in. I've already started this. So this is the first assignment that we were given as students. And then in this course, I'm giving to my students as well. So you make a little grid, and then the idea is to make these lines, which you start with a vertical line, and then a horizontal line, and then you go into the diagonals. And that's something which the idea for this assignment is to try to keep a very light line. And for that, we usually use a 4H or a 5H pencil. And once you start the line work, the aim of that is to keep a very straight line. And when you make these lines, they should be perpendicular to each other. And also very light at the same time. And they should not be broken lines. They should be straight lines that starts from the top and goes to the bottom. And anyone can start practicing that. And the idea is that as you start making these minute lines, which are supposed to be as close together as possible, as light as possible, you start to really notice what lies between the gaps in those lines, for example, what sort of line is happening. And gradually, the eyes open up into these tiny windows that we make, 1-inch windows. And that trains you for the later assignments that we start with as well. But the idea is to make a complete grid of maybe 50 or 60 squares, starting with these lines, and then moving on to other important assignments with the pencil. And then once you've done these, and it takes a time, you're supposed to take your time. You shouldn't rush into these. It should be a really contemplative sort of practice. You can even, sometimes it helps me, for example, to breathe into the lines, and that makes my hand a little bit more stability. And then the idea is to practice it in all different directions so that the hand, eye, as well as the muscles get tuned into making different types of lines. And then once we've done those lines, maybe, yeah. After we've done a lot of these assignments, all the squares, and then you do the diagonals, then we move to the next step. And usually this takes a week. This is the first assignment for the first week that you repeat these lines. And then we move to the next type of assignment, which is, which most traditionally also students would start with, which are flower studies. And with a flower study, the important thing is that after practicing for so long with these straight lines, you start practicing curves, how to make a petal and how to make your hand rotate almost in a sort of 360 and all around. And we'll do that. I'll show you how we do those sort of flower studies as well as we move to our next assignment.
And Murad, with the line assignment, how do you know when you have a good line too?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you look at it in some of these lines here in detail, it should be consistent. It shouldn't suddenly be dark or suddenly light. So it should be one intensity and it shouldn't be broken too much. And then the next line should be evenly gapped. So they shouldn't have too many gaps in between. Initially, even now that I'm starting, for example, the hand wobbles a lot because it takes a little bit of time for your breath to get in sync with your hand and your eye. So usually it takes 1 or 2 squares for the hand to settle down. So it's something which happens really slowly. One isn't supposed to rush into it. And then you get into this groove where you just know you're hitting the right tone again and again and again.
Thank you. And should we segue here to this, to talking about flower studies and how they were functioning in a Tasvir Khana workshop?
Yeah. So flower studies are usually what we do next. And that's what our students here are also now doing, that they've started to, they've been doing in the 2nd and 3rd weeks, flower studies that you can take from borders. That's something that is an extremely important aspect, particularly of Mughal painting. And it's also like the second bedrock. If line is important, then this idea of moving your hand in all different directions is also equally important. And we start with simple basic flower studies initially, and then we move to these more complicated assignments, which you can see, for example, if you want to talk a little bit about this, Liz.
Thank you. And this particular flower study from the WICMA collection has been a joy to work with and get to see in all different ways, as Amber will be talking about in just a moment. The study dates to about 1770 from the Mughal Empire that Murad mentioned, so that area in northern India. And the size can be really hard to judge from digital images. That's something we've been working with a lot in the last year. So the size of this, it's only about 7 inches high. And then for the entire paper too, I should mention. And then the paper is about 3 3/4 inches wide. So a very small sheet of paper. You can only imagine the fine detail that goes into this, especially if you were just doing some of that line practice with Murad. Murad, is there anything else you want to add about this particular study and why you're so excited to add it to the exhibition?
Yeah, let's look at a close-up of one flower, and then maybe everyone can see the amount of work and detail that's gone into it. So as Liz mentioned, these are tiny, minuscule flowers. And inside of those, you have this fascinating rendering technique. So you see how the artist would first have outlined the flower and then would have gone in to render it. And you have 2-3 different types of rendering techniques that any student can learn in this. You have the minute dots with which you render these stipple-like dots that become very, very refined. Then you have these linear elements as well in the petals. So you learn how to do rendering through linear strokes. So you have different styles contained within, different techniques contained within this one tiny flower, which is part of this larger composition. So, and it also demands that you have a really strong and confident hand in order to outline everything after you've rendered the flower. Then you go in again and do the final outlining. So everything is contained within this.
Hello again, my name is Amber, and what we're looking at on this screen are still images of reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI, which became such an amazing opportunity for me to combine my work at WICMA with the work in preparation for the studio course Tasvir Khana. So RTI itself uses multiple photos of an object that are then digitally compiled into one view. The technology simulates shining a flashlight over an object. And as you can see with these stills, we are able to apply filters to highly detailed views of a particular piece, in this case, the flower study. So it's incredible to think about, as we've just mentioned, the scale of the object and the level of detail we can see in these still shots. So by taking away the color or diffusing the color, we're able to isolate their linear qualities of the painting and get a better idea of the paint density. One of my favorite aspects of this technology is the fact that small scale objects that are 2D appear three-dimensional. As you can see, this like lifted quality of the flowers. For example, the pistils or pollen on the center of each flower appear raised. And we were able to, with the views of given by RTI, able to find out that the artist used gold on the pollen buds. In this next slide, we're able to see more of a short clip of the RTI file in the RTI viewer and how we can manipulate the object. So in the studio course Tasvir Khana, we took a deep dive into the object and engaged with this process of deep, close looking. We were able to view the RTI file within the gallery, and it became such an amazing experience of comparing the physical piece that was installed with this close-up view of the object. In the first couple of weeks of this course, as Murad mentioned, we focused on lines, similar to the studies that you're able to do today. And we were able to replicate one of these flower buds, which was one of our more recent assignments. So students, including myself, were able to use this technology to better understand things like the composition, the artistic process, and the usage of materials. And is a great segue into later parts in the semester where we really focus on pigment and pigment application.
Yes, thank you so much, Amber, for taking us through those wonderful details. And so using that knowledge as well, we can also tell how the line work was applied. And usually the way this is done is that, as you might be able to make out in this detail, what we do here is that we start drawing, and this is what we were doing with these flower studies. The aim is that you start first and foremost with an incredibly light drawing, almost like a sketch. And then you gradually start to build it up. For example, if you have this one petal, you have a very, very light drawing. And once you know, all right, this drawing seems to work, then you can finalize the outlines of that particular flower. So then you can go in, and the key is not to make a very dark line immediately. You make a light line, and then you keep repeating that line again and again until it starts to become dark. And then you do that with all the flowers. And you make, you keep repeating that with all the flowers till everything is of a consistent, slightly darker outline. And then you can go in, and once you've done all of the flowers, like all of the petals in the flower like this, bringing them to a sort of consistently slightly darker outline, then you can go in and start the rendering. And with the pencil, it's a really good tool to control your rendering. With the brush, it's slightly more difficult. So it's good that we first practice with the pencil. And the strokes that we use for rendering in the pencil, I'm just going to magnify it over here so you can understand the type of rendering technique we use, is we actually make circular motions. This is the way that you render. You don't render it in the sort of more Western studio type practice, not like this. You actually make circular motions so that everything builds up gradually. And you have more control over your motion as well. So, but of course you do that in a really minute space. So it's more challenging that way. So I'm just going to render the tip of this little petal.
Murad, we had a great question from the audience if you ever erase lines.
Well, if you make a mistake, then, but that's ideally you shouldn't, because the eraser, there's always some sort of residue left. And because when you're using brush and ink, there's no space, there's no room for mistakes. So, which is why it's important to start extremely light, so light that only you know what your drawing is. And then when you're satisfied with that first early sketch, then you can finalize the lines. So then there's little space for making mistakes, because at the end of the day, what we're building up to is how to use the squirrel hairbrush. So here also, I'm not putting much pressure on the pencil, on the paper at all. I'm making a very light line, but I'm just repeating that line, the circular motion again and again until it starts to get dark. I'm not just going in and making a dark line, but that'll be harsh and it'll stand out. So everything has to be, I guess what you can describe, particularly with the Mughal school of painting, is that you're supposed to hide the technique. You're not supposed to show, I mean, for example, when we think of Japanese Zen calligraphic sort of artwork, the whole point is to show how the brush moves, the drip of the paint. In this, it's the complete opposite. You are not supposed to show the hand. You're not supposed to show your own presence as much. So that in the end, it just seems like it appeared out of nowhere.
And do you have any tips for lefties like myself who tend to smear pencil in particular? Was there a different way that that was approached or other ways that it's kind of done these days?
Same, just make sure that you put a piece of paper underneath. Actually, traditionally, even if you look at paintings and historical paintings in which you see artists sometimes shown as self-portraits or something, they actually only rest their little pinky finger and then work. That's a lot of skill so that they don't smudge any of the paper. Of course, most of us don't have that sort of control, so we just do the full palm. And if we're doing that, then it's better to put a piece of paper there so that we don't smudge things. So this is just an example of that petal. Then we can also work a little bit on that flower. I just took the one study from those 11 flowers from the painting that Liz was talking about. And we do the same thing with that. In that we gradually build the entire painting up. And I'll just do a little bit of one petal. Please let me know if I'm going over time. So I'm not pressing the pencil too hard at all. And then doing the same technique of the circular motion of the pencil. Sometimes when there are these little spots that appear, you can even go in and just dab the pencil to fill a gap. And this technique is called pardakht, this rendering technique in which you do this little stipples, P-A-R-D-A-K-H-T, pardakht. It's a very important, especially with the Mughal school of Indian painting. Pardakht is really important. And these techniques really come in handy when you're doing really beautiful, refined portraits, for example, landscapes in which you have to show merging spaces like cloud forms or rocks. This rendering technique comes in handy a lot.
Murad, there are also some questions about the hardness of the pencil lead that you're using, and also in terms of sharpening. And I can say that for sharpening pencils, Murad did do an amazing video that's available on the website all about how to sharpen too.
Yeah, we use a very refined sandpaper and just go over the sandpaper while always rotating our pencil so that it's even. You don't want it to be just sharpened from one side. It should be like a needle edge. So we keep it sharpened regularly. That's how you start slowly building up the whole painting. And then maybe we can move to the next one. If you, Liz, if you want to talk about.
And sure, actually a quick question before we move on to portraits. There was a great question about Wicma's painting. So knowing that you're copying that painting, in the Wicma painting, someone noted that the contour of each petal is unique and was wondering if the artist was working from life.
That's a wonderful question. Most probably he was not. In many cases, a lot of the Mughal floral paintings were taking inspiration from a lot of Dutch flower paintings that were coming through prints that were brought through traders and other people. And so many cases they were using those. In other cases, they would actually stylize, use a stylized language. So making from life would not be as common. I would think it would, even if they sketched from life, they would translate it and idealize and stylize it.
Thank you. And another question about palm smearing, which might be from another lefty after my own heart. Someone asking, can working on very small paper, again, thinking about the size of the Wicma flower study, can working on very small paper help to limit the palm smearing?
It can, but usually with Indian painting, you also have a border. So you actually don't work on a small piece of paper because this is essentially the art of the book. So many of these paintings that were made historically would eventually become part of albums, like albums with calligraphy and paintings, or they would be illustrations illustrating a particular text. So usually they wouldn't be made in isolation. They would have a larger border. And that's something that we will build up towards in the course as well, on how to make a border around it. So sometimes you can put a piece of paper and then carve a small window out of it so that you only see the point that you're working at. You can do that.
Thank you. And another question from the audience, do you consult the Shastras for instruction, or are there varied instructions depending on the genre?
That's a nice question. I don't think even historically in painting, there must have been a received knowledge of what the Shastras said, but directly, I doubt that artists were actually aware or conscious or referring to those manuals or texts ever, in fact. It's something that is more passed on from master to disciple. So it's more of what you received from your teacher. So in my case, what I received from my teacher, Ustad Bashir Ahmed in Lahore, is what has stuck rather than textbook knowledge. And that's how most historical traditional arts and crafts have survived in South Asia, is through a more visceral and passed on sort of practical knowledge.
Thank you. And that's actually a great segue to another question. Is the tradition limited to male artists? And maybe thinking about the time of the painting we were discussing, that's about 1770 versus today.
Excellent question. And it's something that one should keep in mind. So historically, both men and women would train in this practice. It was part of elite training as well. So we know historically that noblemen, noblewomen, princesses would learn this art. But then there was also the profession. Just like in South Asia, everything is a family-based profession, which is passed down within the family. And in that profession, it would be basically the male members of the family who would practice this. Although in the Mughal school, we know that there were women artists as well. There weren't as many. So a majority was, of course, all male practice. But then we have paintings that have been signed by women artists as well from the Mughal atelier. And we don't know whether that was just, whether those were professional artists or those were trained artists, which were part of the nobility or the elite. So, but it was a shared sort of practice, but as a profession, it was primarily men who would practice it. And if you think we should move on to the next, we can do that as well.
Sure. And there was just, someone had missed your answer about the hardness of the lead that you're using.
Yeah, so it's 4H or 5H. So it should be pretty hard because you want to do that repetitive action. So if it's a harder pencil, you can keep on repeating it really lightly on the paper, and then it gets darker on its own. Whereas if you use it like HB or 2B, those sort of pencils, you have no control because they're far too dark and they're too soft. So we need a harder pencil.
Thank you. And is this a good time to segue to portraits then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Murad, do you want to tell us a little bit about portraiture in the Tasvir Khana, and especially thinking about if you often start with something like lines and then a flower study, at what point might you do a portrait like this one, for example?
Yes, so this is really learning how to do portraiture, whether that's animal portraiture or human portraiture, is really the final chapter in the learning process of Musawwari. It requires all your skill, and that's why even in the Mughal atelier, particularly in the early years, it was the master artist of the atelier who would do the portraits, particularly the portrait of the emperor or of the other nobility. Even if other artists working on the same painting would be doing the border or the flower or the background, the master would come in and work on the portrait, because that's what requires the most subtlety, the most control, the most observation. And portraiture is essentially, one could say that that is the main art form, or the main subject matter for this art form. Portraiture was the most commonly represented theme in Indian miniature painting. So you end up showcasing all the skills that you've learned along the process. If we go into the detail of this beautiful portrait, and then, or do you want to talk about this a little bit, and then we can talk about the details?
I can give some background on this first, and then absolutely let's go to the details. So this is an 18th century Pahari painting from the collection. It was created in the Punjab Hills, so in the at the foot of the Himalayas in present-day northern India. And it shows a ruler or a Raja seated on the right with his hookah, and then an attendant on the left. And one of the things I love too is seeing how scaling here can reflect the importance of the figure. So even seated, the Raja is much larger than the other person. Is there anything else you wanted to add about it too, Murad?
Yeah, just talking about the elements that we learn as students are all put to work and practice in portraiture. For example, you see how his robe is full of these beautiful tiny little flowers. So you can put that to practice. You see how in the background you have these linear elements of the idea of having that straight line comes into practice as well, even on that dais that he's sitting on. And then when we go into the details, into his portrait, we can really understand how all of the skills that one learns throughout the process are practiced and applied here. So if we go into the next, and even the final one. So here you can see how this particular face, the artist has rendered almost each and every hair of the beard. So that's really important. If you look at the eyebrows, they are so softly and beautifully rendered, and the way they just sort of wispy, the way they just fade into the skin as they end is so subtle and beautiful. And also the way the neck after the hair, it has this subtle roundness. So these are all very conventionalized techniques of rendering the face. You put a lot of emphasis on the eyes. Those should be the boldest, darkest place, so that when you look at a portrait, your vision immediately goes into the eye. And then other aspects, so it's beautifully balanced with a very delicate outline all around it. So we see all those techniques coming into play here.
And there was an excellent question, if we could go back a slide, about perspective, and that sometimes we see a linear perspective or one point perspective. And there was a question if there were some different perspective systems being used here. Could you talk about that a little bit, Murad?
Usually what Indian painting, particularly schools that are inspired by, well actually all Indian painting use is multiple perspectives. So you could see this carpet with the stripes. It's almost like a bird's eye view. But then when you look at the bed that the Raja is sitting on, has more of a perspective, seeing from our own view as well as his portrait. So it has multiple perspectives happening at the same time. And that is a principle of maximum visibility that was applied in a very ingenious way throughout Indian miniature painting, in which you show that thing that is most important most clearly. It's about showing that which is necessary for the narrative. It's not about following the accidentality of nature, because that is just an illusion created by our eye. Perspective does not really exist in the sense that that's something that we exists in through our optics. But in reality, a tree which is in front of us and a tree which is a mile away might be exactly the same size. So the miniature painter would actually show them the same size, because human perspective is not as important as this multiple perspective.
Thank you. And I can also add for context to the size of this, just to give folks at home a sense of the original artwork. So this one is about 6 5/8 inches tall for the whole sheet. And then the width is about 11 5/16 inches.
Should we move to our final little exercise? So here I just had started a very, very light sketch of arguably one of the most favorite subject matters in all Indian painting, which is the representation of Lord Krishna, one of the most important avatars of Vishnu. And you see that in all schools of Indian painting. And so I thought I would use that just to demonstrate some of the ideas. It's the same principle that you first make a really light drawing. And once you've finalized the sketch, then you can go over it and make it slightly darker.
And we have a great question about scale for these, especially looking at your 1-inch grid. Were magnifying glasses ever used as aids in drawing?
It seems like, at least in the Mughal atelier, they did use some sort of monocles that might have been introduced through Europe. But I myself have tried them and it just throws me off, because suddenly you see this big giant brush and then everything else is small, and I always mess it up. So maybe it takes more practice. But mostly, I don't think it was very common though. I don't think it was that common. And let's just look at the eyebrows, for example. With the eyebrows, you try to imitate exactly the way the eyebrows are made, and you just follow that along. And I'm just repeating this very light stroke again and again and again. And then in order to make it merge with the skin, you also render around it very lightly as well.
I know that we're focusing on graphite for the demonstration today, Murad, but there's been some really interesting questions about pigment. So for example, would pencil be underneath the ink drawing? And also wondering about, is the pencil a sketch that's under the drawing along those lines, or is it practice for a separate ink drawing?
Excellent questions again. So of course, as I mentioned earlier on, a pencil is very much a modern modification of just for the first few assignments, so that you start getting into this groove of the practice. But historically, they would have used some sort of charcoal-like, not charcoal itself, but some sort of charcoal-like tool to make an underdrawing. Sometimes they actually would also do tracings. Tracing was very, very common. It's called a charba, C-H-A-R-B-A, or sometimes it's also called a khaka, K-H-A-K-A. And what would happen is that a master artist in the atelier would perfect, for example, say a face of Krishna or the figure of Krishna. And then his understudy or one of the assistants would take a tracing paper and trace that perfected face. And then they would puncture little perforated the sheet with tiny, tiny needle holes, and then pass a little bit of carbon on top of those holes so that the tracing comes out into the paper itself. And then that would be the underdrawing. And then they would go in with a brush. They would start off with a very, very, very light tone of this this particular red, or some sort of family of red, and they would do that as the first coat, and that would be the drawing. Then they would go on top of it with the primer, which would be a white, opaque white thin wash that would make the first red drawing much more subdued. And on top of that, they would go in with black or brownish, most probably usually black ink with the brush. And then they would outline the final line. And then they would go in with the pigments and start doing the rendering the way I am doing right now. So in a way, the technique doesn't change in the sense that you end up making the same drawing or the portrait maybe 8 or 10 different times, from the tracing to the final painting. And then once you've done the flat wash of the paint, then you go in again with rendering with these techniques that we were talking about. And then in the end, you go in with a final outline of the entire painting, and you keep burnishing the whole painting at every step. So really the hand of the artist is very, very hidden behind all of that, because you end up copying and repeating the same face or whatever you're making again and again in the same place till you have this finally very refined artwork.
And as you're going over the lines with the graphite, are you going in one direction or are you going back and forth ever?
You can go back and forth. I'm just repeating, like I'm doing his pupil right now. I'm just repeating it back and forth. And then you just keep on gradually darkening it. And it takes a long time. It would take, a few days to multiple sessions to finally get the full face. So we can stop whenever you think it's time.
We have some related questions as you're doing this profile face. One person noted profile seems to be the most important kind of portrait. Is that accurate? Why, if it is?
Yes, indeed. The profile is the most common favored style or way of portraying figures. There are lots of theories behind why that is, because of course in sculpture and other things you don't have that, but in painting it's usually the profile. Later on with the Mughals, the 3/4 is also introduced, but you very rarely do you see a front-on face. There are many, many theories behind that. One possibility is that they want to capture the individual in their most hieratic, most idealized form, not in their accidental form. And so if you capture them in a profile, you get, just like similar to the sort of ancient Egyptian type drawings and paintings, you capture their more refined and more idealized persona, rather than with all the accidentalities. Suddenly when you see the full face, you realize, oh, this person has, is a human being. He's got other sort of features which can be hidden when you do the profile. That's one theory, but it just seems like it became a convention pretty early on. And then that's something that's stuck.
And along those lines, there's a question, if you could talk a little bit more about facial expression. Was it of interest to artists to show different expressions?
Not at all, in the sense that this is, once again, it is very much about human emotions, but the way the human emotions are shown are not necessarily individualistic emotions. They are more cultural stereotypes or types. So usually emotion in an Indian painting would be shown through gesture, and that can be even linked back to the idea of dance and theater in ancient India as well, that you don't make random gesture, you don't make random emotions. Everything is really precise. You follow a particular aesthetical theory in which a particular gesture would say that you're sad, or another gesture would say that you're amazed. So, and then all of nature would participate in that particular mood. So it's more about creating moods than, once again, accidental sentiments. Or so that's why you don't have facial expressions, because you're not capturing people's egoistical individuality. You're capturing ideas. You're capturing idealized sentiments or idealized moods.
So with this idealization, there's a question, were the portraits made from life then?
Yes, in many cases, of course, Krishna being a mythic god, they wouldn't have. But in the case of like the Raja that we saw before, he would have been made from life. And we have a lot of sketches and drawings of these artists when they made these drawings from life. So what would happen is that they would then transform the quick sketch of a person into a final painting. And during that process, the idealization occurs. Just by containing something in an outline makes it more hieratic and more removed from a sort of everyday world of action reactions. It makes it more static and more removed. So that's how the process works. So yes, a lot of the portraits that we see, particularly in the Mughal school, were made from life or copied. Once the type was established, it was then copied again and again.
Thank you. Another question was, what issues of cultural appropriation arise for artists outside of India or an Indian background using these techniques and imagery in their own work?
I would say none, because this is a practice that has always been open to learning from other traditions. It's a practice that has not ever been hermetically sealed, and which is why it is still today a living, breathing contemporary practice, particularly, for example, in Pakistan. A lot of contemporary artists are working today globally, teaching as well, and participating in galleries and biennales. And even if we look at the Mughal atelier, it brought, when it came into South Asia, when the Mughals came into South Asia, they brought with them Persian and Central Asian techniques and languages. Then they also merged that language with local Indic languages, visual languages, and then they also heavily were inspired by European painting and drawing and prints. So by its very nature, this practice is something that is always taking and giving from other cultures. So I think thinking about this as a sort of hermetically sealed others language, I would say that would be the wrong approach. Anyone can, should and can experiment with this, use it in their own practices, knowing that this has always been art practice that has looked towards global networks historically and down to this day.
Thank you so much, Murad. So at this point, we'd love to open it up to the audience. We've been trying to keep up with the fabulous questions that you've all been asking throughout. Really nice observations. I love the comment about how meditative it is. I completely agree. Does anyone else have any questions? And we'll just keep looking for those and then wrap up in a few minutes. So I see one question here, Murad. Do these ideas about perspective connect with the concept of not needing to show the handwork or the artist's hand, as you were saying? Is there more behind all of this?
Perhaps, but because there's no real literature that talks about that, one can only sort of conjecture around it. My safest guess is that because this practice is very, in one certain sense, very conventionalized, in the sense that you have a certain type of language that which is passed on and on and on. That doesn't mean that innovation doesn't happen. Of course it does, and a lot of innovation happens, but there's certain aspects like the type of pigments that are used, the type of paper that's used, the type of ornamentation, certain aspects that become really deeply embedded in the practice. And I would say the idea of the profile has just become one of those deeply ingrained aspects.
Thank you. We've had some requests for a pigments demonstration, so that's something to think about moving forward. For today, we are focusing on graphite, also just trying to think about something that would be accessible to a whole range of folks joining us this evening. But I should mention again that Murad is doing a series of videos for his class and for the public, talking about how to prepare and sharpen your graphite pencil, how to prepare paper, how to prepare pigments if you'd like to grind some yourselves, in a whole range of different techniques. So even though that's something we won't cover this evening, that's something you can definitely be watching for on the website. There were some questions too. Someone had come in late and was just wondering if you could mention again what type of paper is being used, Murad.
Yeah, the paper is, right now, you mean? This paper.
I think, yes, just what paper is being used. So maybe if there's a difference to talk about that too.
Oh, I mean, you can use any smooth paper. You could even use photocopy paper. It's just more about, learning how to use your hand and looking minutely. But we were using Sennelier calligraphy paper, the Sennelier brand of calligraphy paper. That's pretty, it has a beautiful creamish tone, but it's also really smooth. So you can do a lot of those techniques. But eventually, of course, we use the handmade paper from India made of cotton rag and hemp fiber.
One more pigment question was, when you do use the brush, what is the pigment used at this stage of line work?
That's usually carbon black. It's carbon black, or if you want to do just the first basic drawing, you can use, there's a cousin of the cochineal that is made in South Asia, which is called lak, made from those dead bugs that makes this beautiful red color. So we dilute this and thin it out and use that as well for the first drawing, and then you use carbon black.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to pop in and just thank you all so much. This has been amazing. We have had so many wonderful questions, and I hope that we have answered most, if not all of them for you. I really do want to emphasize Liz's beautiful commentary about, the videos that are being produced as part of this class, and really also underscore that this has been a very special moment for us. As many of you know, the museum has not been able to be fully open to the public, so we have really been so excited to be working with Murad and the classes that are working with us and are able to access the museum to really make the content that is being done with our collections more accessible to our communities at large. So we want to really thank you all for being here tonight, making such a vibrant program through your questions, and of course to thank Murad, Liz, and Amber for their incredible responses, their incredible work. Amber's work just both as a TA and participant and student in the class, and her work with us at the museum is so invaluable. And Murad and Liz have just led the charge in really creating a beautiful exhibition. And I think there's also going to be a link in the chat for you. You can actually, we have something called Matterport, which is an interactive website that can let you actually explore explore the exhibition yourself through moving through the actual space. We also had a question about that there are 5 videos right now on the web. Will there be more soon? I think the answer is yes. You can actually really follow along as the course unfolds over the coming weeks and months. Murad is continuously filming with us and really delving into just some of we're just really touched on really just some of the amazing techniques. I did also want to just plug one more time the program on April 15th, which will also be at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Where Murad will be in conversation with scholar Gina Kim. That program, which will also be a conversation rather than done today, will really focus on pigments, thinking about also the process and the use of pigments in South Asian painting, but also about the materials themselves, about the science, really delving deep into also the symbolism. So that should be really exciting. We hope you'll consider joining us. And I think we have a link also in the chat for you if you'd like to sign up and learn more. So with that, I just want to give a huge thanks to Murad and Amber. Thank you so much to all of you who've joined us tonight. It's always amazing in this virtual time to feel like we can really have a dialogue together and that you can all participate with us. I feel like this kind of open Q&A is one of the things that as a program curator, I feel like is one of the positives to this virtual time. So thank you for joining us. And if you have any other questions or comments for us, please be in touch through our website, through our email, wicma@williams.edu. You'll also receive a follow-up email as part of your registration with a survey and information on how to contact us if you would like to be in touch with us about anything that you experienced tonight. So thank you so much. And thank you, Murad, Liz, Amber. Thank you, Terry. Thank you to Ann Kennedy, who's also behind the scenes with us, and to so many of you who just made this evening so vibrant with your incredible questions. So take care, everybody. We'll see everyone soon.